All right, so you're trying to understand these covert contracts in your marriage.
Yeah.
And how historical forces, especially from a men's rights perspective,
Uh-huh.
have kind of shaped the institutions around us.
Right.
You're really interested in like the impact of feminism,
Yeah.
Marxism, and want to kind of see how we got to where we are today.
Exactly.
For this deep dive, we have some excerpts from The Tyranny of the Minority by Conrad Riker.
Okay.
It's a book that really challenges the traditional narrative of power dynamics.
Yeah.
And argues that a small but really powerful minority is actually in control, and they're often employing tactics like manipulating language
Right.
and even weaponizing emotions to kind of maintain that control.
Yeah. It's pretty fascinating how Riker suggests that this minority
Yeah.
uses fear and guilt to silence the majority, you know?
Like how...
Think about your own marriage. Like, have you ever felt hesitant
Mhm.
to speak your mind, like worried about maybe being labeled insensitive or out of touch?
Oh.
That feeling, that hesitation could be a manifestation of what Riker's talking about.
Wow, that's a really interesting connection to like everyday life.
Yeah.
So how does this minority actually maintain its power?
So the book really dives into how they've been incredibly effective at utilizing technology and social media.
Okay.
You know, think about it like platforms like Facebook. That's
Yeah.
where a huge chunk of the population gets their news.
It's true.
Half of U.S. adults, according to Pew Research.
Wow.
And these platforms are designed to prioritize engagement, not truth.
Right.
So the more outrageous and the more emotionally charged the content, the more it spreads.
Yeah, it's like a breeding ground for sensationalism, and truth often gets lost in the noise.
Exactly. And Riker gives some pretty stark examples of this, you know, like the deplatforming of figures like Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos.
Right.
Regardless of what you think about those guys, they were effectively silenced.
Yeah.
And it highlights how these platforms can act as these gatekeepers controlling who gets heard and who gets shut down, further controlling the narrative.
Yeah. It's not just about who gets a platform, though.
Right.
The book also talks about how language itself is being manipulated
Yes.
as a tool of control.
Absolutely. He calls it the hijacking of language.
Yeah.
You know, words we hear all the time now.
Yeah.
Woke, problematic microaggressions. These terms are used to control the narrative and shut down any debate.
It's like a new vocabulary designed to enforce conformity.
Exactly.
You know, like think about terms like toxic masculinity.
Right.
How does that impact the way we view even like traditional male roles and behaviors, even within a marriage?
It's a subtle form of pressure to conform to a very specific worldview.
Yeah.
And Riker argues that this manipulation is like straight out of Orwell's 1984.
Wow.
Control the language, control the thought. It's a chilling thought.
That's true.
You know, if we can't articulate our ideas, how can we challenge anything, even in our own relationships?
So we've got technology amplifying this minority's voice.
Right.
We've got language being used as a weapon. What's the next tactic that Riker identifies?
So then the book dives into the weaponization of emotions.
Okay.
You know how progressive ideologies really exploit these feelings like fear, guilt, and anger to shut down opposition?
I can see that.
Think about the concept of cancel culture.
Oh, yeah.
Someone expresses an opinion that's deemed offensive and boom, they're ostracized, their career possibly ruined.
Yeah.
It's a mob mentality fueled by outrage, and this isn't just happening on like a societal level.
Right.
Think about how guilt might be used in your marriage. Does one partner constantly bring up past mistakes or societal privileges to kind of shut down a conversation?
Oh, yeah.
Or avoid taking responsibility?
It's almost like a manipulation tactic.
Exactly.
Using guilt to control the situation.
Yeah, and the book argues that this is happening all around us. It's even being amplified by those social media algorithms we talked about.
It's a vicious cycle.
Totally.
We see something online that triggers our fear or our anger.
Right.
We share it. The algorithm sees that engagement shows us more of the same and just reinforces those emotions.
Which creates these echo chambers where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Right.
It makes it harder to challenge or even recognize the manipulation.
So Riker has laid out like a pretty compelling case so far.
Yeah.
For how this minority maintains control.
Yeah.
But how does that translate to the bigger picture?
Right.
To the institutions that really shape our lives?
Well, that's where Riker gets even more specific.
Okay.
He argues that science, which should be about objective inquiry, is being twisted to fit progressive agendas. He uses the example of climate change.
Okay.
He argues that the science isn't settled, but anyone who questions the prevailing narrative is immediately branded a denier.
So dissenting voices are silenced even in the realm of like scientific inquiry.
Exactly. And it's not just climate change.
Mm.
The book discusses how the concept of gender is being redefined. Progressive ideologies push this idea that gender is entirely a social construct, completely separate from biological sex.
Mm-hmm.
Riker argues that this goes against basic biology and could even impact the way we approach things like family roles and responsibilities.
So he sees this redefinition of gender as another example of how this minority is pushing their agenda, even if it means contradicting like established scientific understanding.
Precisely. And from this attack on science, he moves on to what he calls an attack on masculinity itself.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
How does Riker connect masculinity to this larger narrative of control?
He argues that society is waging a war on traditional masculine virtues,
Okay.
like strength, courage, self-reliance.
These are all good things.
Think about how these virtues might be perceived in a modern context.
Yeah.
Even within a marriage. Are they valued or are they seen as outdated,
Well,
even harmful?
It's true. There's a lot of talk about toxic masculinity these days,
Exact.
which seems to paint these traditional male traits in a very negative light.
Right, and he claims that this negative portrayal is having a devastating impact on men,
Wow.
leading to a crisis of masculinity, and this crisis, he argues, weakens the family unit.
So he sees a direct connection between this attack on masculinity and the breakdown of the traditional family structure.
Absolutely. The book discusses how the nuclear family, which he believes is the foundation of a healthy society, is under attack from these progressive ideologies.
So he sees things like the rise of single-parent households
Yeah.
and the push for alternative family structures as symptoms of a society in decline.
Yes, and he ties this decline back to the attack on masculinity. He argues that without strong fathers, boys are being deprived of essential role models.
So the domino effect, weaken men, weaken families, weaken society.
That's the argument he's making, and he doesn't stop there. He delves into the exploitation of victimhood, arguing that it's become like a currency for power in our society.
This is interesting. How does he connect victimhood to this power dynamic?
He argues that the more oppressed you claim to be, the more attention, sympathy, and ultimately power you can command.
So it's like a competition to see who's the most oppressed.
Right.
And that dynamic can be used to manipulate situations and gain control.
Exactly. And he points to the woke culture and social justice movements as examples,
Okay.
arguing that they often inflate claims of victimhood to gain leverage.
So he's not denying that real discrimination exists.
No, not at all.
But he's saying that the constant focus on victimhood can be used to silence dissent and shut down conversations.
That's his argument, and it's something to consider even in the context of your own marriage.
Right.
Are there dynamics where claims of victimhood are being used to control the conversation or avoid responsibility?
That's a really insightful question.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you think about how these larger societal trends can play out on a personal level.
Absolutely. And Riker also doesn't shy away from other controversial topics like the medicalization of transgenderism, particularly among children.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What are Riker's concerns in this area?
He argues that Big Pharma is profiting from the medical transition of young people.
Wow.
And he expresses concern about the long-term health effects and the ethics of pushing these treatments on kids who might not fully grasp the consequences. He also criticizes the way any dissenting voices on this topic are quickly silenced.
So once again, we see that theme of shutting down debate.
Right.
And controlling the narrative.
Exactly. And as we delve deeper into the book, we see this theme of thought control emerging even more strongly.
Okay.
He argues that these progressive movements are using really sophisticated tactics to control how we think and what we're allowed to say.
This is getting pretty heavy. How does he suggest this thought control is happening?
He points to the dominance of progressive ideas in academia and the media.
Okay.
He also discusses how social media algorithms are designed to reinforce our existing beliefs and filter out any dissenting viewpoints, creating those echo chambers we talked about earlier.
So it's like being trapped in a bubble where only one perspective is allowed.
That's the idea. And Riker argues that this thought control is a threat to freedom and democracy.
Wow.
You know, if we can't think freely, we can't make informed decisions.
It's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder if this is all true. What can we do about it?
That's exactly what we'll be exploring in part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay.
Riker does offer some solutions and strategies for resisting this tyranny of the minority, and we'll unpack those in detail.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, me too. Picking up where we left off, one of the things that Riker talks about is how this tyranny of the minority extends to attacks on traditional religion, specifically Christianity.
Oh, that's an interesting angle. I'm curious to hear how he connects religion to this larger narrative of like power dynamics.
Yeah.
How does that play out for individuals, especially when we think about marriage and family?
Well, he argues that progressive ideologies are becoming increasingly hostile toward traditional religious beliefs.
Okay.
He points to the example of same-sex marriage
Right.
and how churches that hold the traditional view of marriage being between a man and a woman are facing all this pressure to change their stance.
Yeah.
He sees this as an infringement on religious freedom, a way for these progressive ideologies to kind of force their values on those who hold different, often like deeply rooted religious beliefs.
Yeah, it's like this external pressure
Yeah.
is creating this tension and conflict, even within the sanctity of a marriage.
Exactly. And he goes on to argue that this pressure extends to the public sphere as well,
Okay.
where religious expression is increasingly being pushed out, things like the banning of prayer in schools,
Great.
the removal of nativity scenes during Christmas.
Yeah.
He sees these as attempts to erase religion from public life, to replace traditional values with a secular progressive worldview.
It's interesting to think about how these societal shifts might impact a couple's ability to raise their children according to their faith. If religious expression is being limited in the public sphere, how does that affect the values and traditions that parents are able to pass on?
That's a great point. And it ties directly into his next argument, the destruction of the nuclear family. Riker is very clear in his belief that the nuclear family, a mother, a father, and their children, is the foundation of a healthy society.
Okay.
And he argues that progressive ideologies are actively trying to undermine this structure.
So how does he see that happening, like in our everyday lives? What specific examples does he give?
Well, he points to things like the growing acceptance of single parenthood,
Right.
the push for same-sex parenting as a tax on this traditional family structure.
Okay.
He cites studies that claim that children raised in nuclear families tend to have better outcomes, and argues that the breakdown of this structure is having a negative impact on society as a whole, leading to things like increased crime, poverty, and social dysfunction.
So he's essentially drawing a direct line between the decline of the nuclear family and the rise of these societal problems.
Yes, and it's a controversial argument.
It is.
It's one that many people disagree with.
Of course.
But Riker doesn't shy away from these controversial topics.
Right.
He really challenges the listener to confront these ideas and think critically about how they impact our lives.
It's interesting because on the one hand, you have this push for individual freedom and expression.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you have these traditional structures being challenged and sometimes even demonized.
Right.
It creates this tension between the individual and the collective, the modern and the traditional.
Absolutely. And that tension is really at the heart of a lot of the issues that he explores in the book.
Right.
And it's something that individuals, especially those in committed relationships like marriage, are grappling with on a daily basis.
Yeah. One of the things that I found really compelling in the book was his discussion of how this minority exploits the concept of victimhood. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Well, Riker argues that victimhood has become a currency for power,
Okay.
a way to gain sympathy and leverage in order to advance certain agendas.
Interesting.
He suggests that, the more oppressed you can claim to be,
Right.
the more moral authority you have. And that this dynamic can be used to silence dissent and shut down debate.
So instead of open dialogue and debate,
Yeah.
you have this competition to see who's the most oppressed.
Right.
And that can be very manipulative.
Exactly. And he believes that this focus on victimhood is actually creating division and resentment.
Okay.
Instead of promoting understanding and unity, it leads to this culture of hypersensitivity where people are constantly on edge waiting to be offended.
It's like walking on eggshells all the time.
Right.
Afraid to say the wrong thing and be labeled insensitive or worse.
That's the idea. And he argues that this fear of being labeled is used to control the narrative and silence opposing viewpoints.
Interesting.
He sees this happening in the woke culture and social justice movements, where he claims that accusations of bigotry or prejudice are often used to shut down any critical discussion.
Yeah, it's a powerful tactic because it appeals to emotion rather than logic and reason.
Exactly.
And once you're labeled a certain way, it's very hard to shake that label even if it's completely unfounded.
Exactly. And this can create a really stifling environment for open dialogue, especially within a relationship,
Right.
where trust and communication are so
Of
vital.
course.
If you're constantly afraid of being judged or labeled by your partner, it's hard to be truly open and honest.
That's a really important point. It makes you realize how these larger societal trends can actually seep into our most personal relationships
Absolutely.
and impact the way we interact with each other.
And Riker provides another example of this with his discussion of the medicalization of transgenderism, particularly among children.
That's obviously a very sensitive topic.
Yeah.
What are his main concerns in this area?
Well, he argues that there's this rush to medicalize gender dysphoria, especially among young people,
Okay.
and that this rush is being driven by a combination of ideology and profit. He expresses concern about the long-term effects of hormone therapy and surgery on children.
Yeah.
And he questions whether these young people are truly capable of understanding the full implications of these life-altering decisions.
So he's not necessarily denying the existence of gender dysphoria,
Right.
but he's questioning the approach and the potential for harm,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to kids who are still developing and might be easily influenced by social trends.
That's right. And he also criticizes the role of Big Pharma in this,
Oh, really?
arguing that they're profiting from the medicalization of transgenderism.
Wow.
And that this profit motive is influencing the way this issue is being presented and addressed.
Once again, we see that theme of power dynamics at play. Who's benefiting from this? Who's controlling the narrative?
Right.
These are questions that Riker wants us to ask.
Exactly. And his analysis of thought control takes this idea even further.
Okay.
He argues that these progressive ideologies are using very sophisticated tactics to control what we think, how we think, and even what we're allowed to say.
Okay, this is getting pretty Orwellian. How does he claim this thought control is happening?
He points to the dominance of progressive ideas in academia and the media.
Right.
He argues that these institutions have become echo chambers, where dissenting viewpoints are silenced
Yeah.
and only one perspective is allowed.
Okay.
He also discusses how social media algorithms are designed to reinforce our existing beliefs
Right.
and filter out any information that challenges those beliefs, creating a sort of information bubble
Yeah.
where we're only exposed to things that confirm our biases.
So it's like we're being subtly manipulated into thinking a certain way,
Right.
even without realizing it's happening.
That's the idea, and this can be incredibly dangerous.
It is.
Because it undermines our ability to think critically and make informed decisions.
Absolutely.
If we're only exposed to one side of the story, how can we possibly form our own opinions?
It's almost like we're being trained to think a certain way, to accept certain ideas without question.
And that's what he sees as the ultimate goal of this thought control, to create a society where everyone conforms to the prevailing narrative,
Wow.
where dissent is not tolerated, and where the minority holds absolute power over the minds of the majority.
That's a pretty bleak outlook.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing he doesn't just leave us with this sense of despair.
No.
He must offer some solutions, some strategies for resisting this tyranny of the minority.
You're right. He does offer some hope, some practical advice for how to fight back against this insidious form of control.
Okay.
And that's what we'll delve into in the final part of this deep dive.
Okay, so we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really dissecting Riker's arguments in The Tyranny of the Minority.
Right.
You know, we've uncovered how this supposed minority manipulates language, weaponizes emotions, even attacks institutions like science and religion to maintain control.
It's a lot.
It's pretty unsettling stuff, especially when you start to see how these tactics can play out in your own life, even in your marriage.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
To recognize like the extent of this control.
Right.
But Riker doesn't just leave us hanging.
Okay.
He offers some practical steps we can take to fight back against this tyranny.
Okay, I'm definitely ready for some actionable advice here.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to push back against something so pervasive?
One of the most important things, according to Riker, is to become more media literate.
Okay.
You know, don't just passively consume information. Be critical, question everything.
So don't just accept everything we see on social media or hear on the news as gospel truth.
Exactly. Question the source. Look for evidence. Consider different perspectives.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to call out bias when you see it. Remember, the media landscape is heavily influenced by this minority's narrative. Seek out alternative sources of information voices that challenge the mainstream narrative.
It's like we need to develop our own internal BS detector.
Yeah.
and not be afraid to use it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's step one.
Another important step is to find your tribe.
Okay.
Connect with like-minded individuals who share your values and support your right to think freely.
There's strength in numbers, right?
Exactly. It can be incredibly isolating to go against the grain and challenge the prevailing narrative, especially when you risk being labeled or ostracized.
Right.
That's why it's so crucial to connect with others who understand what you're going through, who validate your experiences and support your right to think for yourself.
Okay.
Riker even suggests forming groups both online and in person to discuss these issues and share strategies for resistance.
So finding community and support is key.
Yes.
But what about actually pushing back against this thought control? It feels so ingrained in our culture.
He stresses the importance of supporting free speech even when you vehemently disagree with what's being said. This is crucial for fostering open dialogue and challenging that prevailing narrative.
Okay.
We need to create a culture where it's okay to have different opinions, where debate is welcomed, not shut down.
It's ironic, isn't it? This minority claims to be all about tolerance and inclusivity.
Right.
Yet they're often the first to shut down anyone who doesn't agree with them.
That's the hypocrisy that Riker highlights in the book.
Yeah. He argues that censorship, even in the name of protecting people from harmful ideas, ultimately backfires. It creates an environment of fear and conformity, where the only acceptable views are those that align with this progressive orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And this isn't just a societal problem. Think about how this might play out in a marriage.
Okay.
If one partner is constantly shutting down the other's opinions or feelings, it creates an imbalance of power.
Right.
And hinders healthy communication.
So even in our personal relationships,
Yes.
we need to be mindful of this tendency to censor or silence opposing viewpoints.
Exactly. It's about creating space for open and honest communication.
Right.
Even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And that requires courage.
Yeah.
Which is another important element that Riker emphasizes.
It takes guts to stand up to the mob.
It does.
To challenge the status quo, to speak truth to power, especially when you risk being ridiculed, ostracized, or even canceled.
It can feel pretty daunting to go up against that kind of pressure.
It's easier to just stay silent and keep your head down.
It is definitely easier to conform.
Yeah.
But Riker reminds us that courage is contagious. When one person speaks out, it gives others permission to do the same. And before you know it, a ripple becomes a wave.
So what does all of this mean for our listeners?
Right.
For those who are grappling with these issues in their own lives, especially within their marriages, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive?
I think first and foremost, I hope this deep dive has been empowering.
Yeah.
You're not alone in feeling like something is off. Like the world has gone a little crazy.
Right.
Riker's book validates those feelings and gives a name to that sense of unease, the tyranny of the minority.
It's like putting a finger on something you've always felt but couldn't quite articulate.
Exactly. And beyond validation, it provides a framework for understanding how this tyranny operates and, more importantly, what you can do to resist it.
Right.
Knowledge is power.
It is.
Now that you're aware of the problem, you can start to see these tactics everywhere.
Yeah.
Even in your own marriage. And you can start to fight back in your own way, in your own life.
So it's not just about understanding these broader societal forces,
Right.
but also about recognizing how they impact our most personal relationships.
Exactly. Maybe it means having those difficult conversations with your partner.
Right.
Setting boundaries and challenging those unspoken covert contracts that may be creating an imbalance of power in your relationship. Maybe it means supporting organizations that are fighting for free speech, or simply being more mindful of the information you consume and the language you use. Every little bit helps.
Don't underestimate the power of your own action.
Exactly. And don't give up hope.
Yeah.
The fight for freedom is never easy, but it's always worth it.
That's true.
Riker's book is a reminder that the future is not set in stone. We have the power to shape it.
So let's get out there and start shaping it.
Yes.
Let's reclaim our freedom, our sanity, and our future, both individually and collectively.
The tyranny of the minority may be loud, but it's up to us to make sure that the silent majority has the last word.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking,
Yeah.
and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Remember, keep asking questions, keep challenging the narratives, and keep fighting for what you believe in. Until next time.